Hello and good evening. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because today we're diving into something truly disturbing. The most bizarre, creative, and downright horrifying punishments from ancient Rome and beyond. And trust me, you're going to wish you lived in literally any other time period by the end of this. Before we start, quick question. If you could travel back to ancient Rome, would you? Yeah, that's what I thought. Now you definitely won't want to after this video. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Welcome to Roman justice, where mercy went to die. Picture this. You're standing in the Roman Forum on a crisp morning in 150 CE. The marble gleams in the sunlight. Senators in their togas discuss grain prices and trade agreements. Merchants set up stalls selling everything from exotic spices to cheap sandals. Children run through the crowds, dogs bark, and the smell of fresh bread mixes with less pleasant urban odours. It's a bustling, living city at the height of imperial power. And somewhere in the distance, cutting through the normal sounds of urban life, you hear screaming. Not the fun kind of screaming, like at a chariot race where your favourite team just took the lead. The bad kind. The kind that makes your stomach drop, your blood go cold, and reminds you that in Rome, punishment isn't just about justice. It's about spectacle, humiliation, and sending a message so terrifying that even thinking about crime makes you break into a cold sweat. Roman punishment operated on principles that seem alien to modern sensibilities, yet influenced Western justice systems for centuries. The foundation was simple but brutal. Your social status determined everything about how you'd be treated if accused of crime. If you were a citizen, particularly a wealthy one with connections, you might get a proper trial with evidence and witnesses. You could hire advocates to argue your case. You might even receive exile to somewhere pleasant, like a Greek island, where you'd spend your remaining days complaining about the wine quality and writing bitter philosophical treatises. But if you were a slave, a foreigner, or just poor and unlucky enough to be in the wrong place when someone needed a scapegoat, the Roman legal system had some truly creative ideas about what to do with you. Ideas that involved animals, fire, heights, water, endless labour, and more pain than human language has adequate words to describe. The Romans didn't just execute people for crimes. That would be too simple, too merciful, too quick. They engineered punishments that were carefully calculated psychological torture, extended physical agony, and public entertainment, all rolled into one horrifying package designed to traumatize everyone who witnessed it. They wanted you to suffer. They wanted the suffering to last. They wanted everyone watching to remember what they'd seen for the rest of their lives. And they wanted the punishment to fit, the crime in the most literal, symbolic, sometimes darkly ironic way possible. The legal philosophy underpinning Roman punishment was fundamentally different from modern rehabilitation-focused justice. Romans weren't trying to reform criminals or reintegrate them into society. They were making examples, deterring future crime through fear, reinforcing social hierarchies, demonstrating state power, and occasionally satisfying the public's appetite for violent entertainment. Punishment served multiple purposes simultaneously, and the condemned individual's welfare ranked dead last among those purposes. Here's the thing about Roman justice that modern people often don't fully grasp. It wasn't really about rehabilitation or even proportional response to crime. There were no prison sentences where you'd learn a trade and rejoin society as a productive citizen. Prison existed, but only as a holding area where you waited for your actual punishment. The real penalty, the thing that happened after trial and conviction, was designed to be permanent. Permanent disfigurement through mutilation. Permanent exile that removed you from civilization. Or very, very permanent death, delivered through methods that ranged from relatively quick to horrifyingly prolonged. And the creativity? Romans approached punishment the way modern engineers approach problem solving. They had specialized tools, developed techniques, refined methods based on centuries of practice, and maintained an entire cultural apparatus dedicated to making examples of people who violated laws or simply angered the wrong official. The Colosseum, that iconic symbol of Roman engineering and architecture. Sure, gladiators fought there, thrilling crowds with skilled combat. But that same arena also hosted executions disguised as theatrical performances, where condemned criminals were forced to reenact myths, usually the parts where the hero dies horribly or gets eaten by monsters. The legal code was vast, specific, and sometimes bizarre by modern standards. There were punishments for theft, different punishments depending on what was stolen and who owned it, punishments for treason, which could mean anything from actual espionage to insufficiently enthusiastic applause when the emperor passed. Punishments for religious violations, from skipping required sacrifices to worshipping unapproved gods. Punishments for fraud, assault, murder, arson, and even insulting statues of deceased emperors who'd been deified. Each category of crime had appropriate punishments, and those punishments were calibrated not just to hurt, but to humiliate. Because in Rome, shame was almost worse than death. Almost. Being executed was bad. Being executed in a way that destroyed your dignity, mocked your crime, and turned your death into entertainment for thousands of spectators. That was the Roman way. They understood that the manner of death communicated messages about the crime, the criminal, and the power of the state. And the creativity. Romans approached punishment the way modern engineers approach problem solving. They had tools, techniques, and an entire cultural apparatus dedicated to making examples of people. The Colosseum. Sure, gladiators fought there, but that same arena also hosted executions disguised as theatrical performances, where condemned criminals were forced to reenact myths, usually the parts where the hero dies horribly. The legal code was vast and specific. There were punishments for theft, punishments for treason, punishments for religious violations, punishments for insulting the emperor's hairline. And each punishment was calibrated not just to hurt, but to humiliate. Because in Rome, shame was almost worse than death. Almost. So buckle up, because we're about to tour the darkest corners of Roman criminal justice, where the penalties were harsh, the methods were bizarre, and mercy was a concept reserved for the gods, who frankly weren't paying that much attention. Anyway. Chapter 2. Crucifixion, the punishment, so brutal it became infamous. Let's start with the big one. The punishment so notorious it defined an entire religion and became synonymous with Roman cruelty. Crucifixion. You've heard of it. You know it was bad. But do you really understand just how calculated, how deliberately agonizing this punishment was? First, crucifixion wasn't Roman originally. They borrowed it from the Carthaginians and Persians, then refined it, perfected it, and turned it into Rome's signature execution method for the worst offenders. Slaves, pirates, rebels, and anyone who seriously annoyed the state. Roman citizens were exempt from crucifixion, not because Romans were squeamish, but because the punishment was considered so degrading that inflicting it on a citizen would diminish Rome's dignity. Here's how it worked, and I'm going to keep this as clinical as possible, because the details are genuinely awful. The condemned would first be flogged, not as a warm-up, but as part of the sentence. The flogging alone could end you, but if it didn't, you'd be forced to carry the crossbeam through the streets to the execution site. This wasn't just physical torture, it was a parade of shame. Everyone in the city could see you, broken, bleeding, stumbling toward your death. Once at the site, usually a road or hilltop where maximum people could witness, The beam would be attached to an upright post already planted in the ground. The condemned would be affixed to this structure. Different methods existed, sometimes ropes, sometimes nails through the wrists and feet, positioned to support body weight while maximizing suffering. The cause of death? That's where it gets particularly grim. You'd think it would be blood loss or shock, but no. The position made breathing increasingly difficult. To inhale, you'd have to push up on your feet, which were also secured, causing excruciating pain. Eventually exhaustion would win. You'd be unable to push up anymore, unable to breathe, and you'd slowly asphyxiate over hours or sometimes days. Romans sometimes broke the legs of the crucified to speed up death, not out of mercy, but because they had schedules to keep. Other times, they'd leave bodies hanging for days as warnings to travellers passing by. The message was clear. This is what happens when you challenge Rome. The psychological component was just as brutal as the physical. Crucifixion was designed to strip away every shred of human dignity. You'd be exposed, often without clothing, unable to control bodily functions, surrounded by crowds that might mock or simply watch with detached interest. It was death as theatre, suffering as public policy. The most famous crucifixion, of course, was Jesus of Nazareth, executed under Pontius Pilate around 30 to 33 CE. But he was one of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, executed this way over Rome's long history. After the Spartacus rebellion in 71 BCE, Rome crucified 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way, lining the road from Capua to Rome with crosses spaced regularly for maximum visibility. Imagine travelling that road, a journey that normally took several days, passing mile after mile of the dying and dead. That's the Rome we're talking about. The crosses weren't removed quickly either. Bodies hung there for days, sometimes weeks, as warnings to anyone passing. Birds would feed on the corpses. The smell would have been overwhelming, and Roman travellers would pass by, perhaps eating lunch, conducting business, completely accustomed to the sight of mass crucifixion as just another feature of the landscape. Josephus, the Jewish historian, described mass crucifixions during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. He wrote that Roman soldiers crucified so many fleeing Jews that they ran out of space for crosses and wood for making them. The soldiers, bored and brutal, began crucifying people in different positions for their own amusement. Some victims were nailed upside down, others spread-eagled, still others in twisted positions that made suffering even worse. The technical aspects of crucifixion reveal Roman engineering applied to human suffering. The crosses weren't always the traditional T-shape we imagine. Sometimes they were X-shaped, called crux decussata, or St. Andrew's cross. Other times they were simple vertical stakes with no crossbeam at all, the victim's arms nailed or tied above their head. The nails, when used, were driven through the wrists rather than the palms. Romans discovered through practice that palms couldn't support body weight. The flesh would tear, and the victim would fall. The wrists, specifically the space between forearm bones, provided better support. The feet were nailed to the side of the upright, usually with a single nail through both feet, or through each foot separately. Sometimes a small seat, called a sedile, would be attached to the cross. This wasn't mercy. It prolonged the agony by preventing the victim from dying too quickly from asphyxiation. They could rest briefly on the sedile, catch their breath, and continue suffering for hours or even days longer than they would have otherwise. The Romans kept detailed records of crucifixions in some provinces. Administrative documents mentioned supplies of wood, nails and ropes purchased specifically for executions. They treated it like any other government function, with budgets, requisitions, and bureaucratic oversight. The banality of the evil is almost more disturbing than the cruelty itself. But here's the thing that really captures Roman mentality. Crucifixion was considered so effective, so terrifying, that it remained in use for centuries. It wasn't abandoned because it was too cruel. Romans didn't think in those terms. It was eventually phased out only after Christianity became the state religion, and having your main religious symbol also be your favorite execution method became awkward. Crucifixion represents Roman punishment at its most calculated. It wasn't about quick justice or efficient execution. It was about prolonging suffering, maximizing humiliation, and creating a spectacle so horrifying that the mere threat of it would keep entire populations in line. And for centuries, it worked. Chapter 3. Poena Cullae, when Rome really wanted to make a point about family values. Now we're getting into the truly bizarre territory. If crucifixion was Rome's standard horror show, Poena Cullae was its artistic masterpiece of psychological terror. This punishment was specifically reserved for one crime: parricide, the killing of a close relative, especially a parent, and the Romans, who valued family structure above almost everything except military conquest, designed a punishment that was equal parts Hello and good evening. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because today we're diving into something truly disturbing. The most bizarre, creative, and downright horrifying punishments from ancient Rome and beyond. And trust me, you're going to wish you lived in literally any other time period by the end of this. Before we start, quick question. If you could travel back to ancient Rome, would you? Yeah, that's what I thought. Now you definitely won't want to after this video. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Welcome to Roman justice, where mercy went to die. Picture this. You're standing in the Roman Forum on a crisp morning in 150 CE. The marble gleams in the sunlight. Senators in their togas discuss grain prices and trade agreements. Merchants set up stalls selling everything from exotic spices to cheap sandals. Children run through the crowds. Dogs bark, and the smell of fresh bread mixes with less pleasant urban odours. It's a bustling, living city at the height of imperial power. And somewhere in the distance, cutting through the normal sounds of urban life, you hear screaming. Not the fun kind of screaming, like at a chariot race where your favourite team just took the lead. The bad kind. The kind that makes your stomach drop, your blood go cold, and reminds you that in Rome, punishment isn't just about justice, it's about spectacle, humiliation, and sending a message so terrifying that even thinking about crime makes you break into a cold sweat. Roman punishment operated on principles that seem alien to modern sensibilities, yet influenced Western justice systems for centuries. The foundation was simple but brutal. Your social status determined everything about how you'd be treated if accused of crime. If you were a citizen, particularly a wealthy one with connections, you might get a proper trial with evidence and witnesses. You could hire advocates to argue your case. You might even receive exile to somewhere pleasant, like a Greek island, where you'd spend your remaining days complaining about the wine quality and writing bitter philosophical treatises. But if you were a slave, a foreigner, or just poor and unlucky enough to be in the wrong place when someone needed a scapegoat, the Roman legal system had some truly creative ideas about what to do with you. Ideas that involved animals, fire, heights, water, endless labour, and more pain than human language has adequate words to describe. The Romans didn't just execute people for crimes. That would be too simple, too merciful, too quick. They engineered punishments that were carefully calculated psychological torture, extended physical agony, and public entertainment, all rolled into one horrifying package designed to traumatize everyone who witnessed it. They wanted you to suffer. They wanted the suffering to last. They wanted everyone watching to remember what they'd seen for the rest of their lives. and they wanted the punishment to fit the crime in the most literal, symbolic, sometimes darkly ironic way possible. The legal philosophy underpinning Roman punishment was fundamentally different from modern rehabilitation-focused justice. Romans weren't trying to reform criminals or reintegrate them into society. They were making examples, deterring future crime through fear, reinforcing social hierarchies, demonstrating state power, and occasionally satisfying the public's appetite for violent entertainment. Punishment served multiple purposes simultaneously, and the condemned individual's welfare ranked dead last among those purposes. Here's the thing about Roman justice that modern people often don't fully grasp. It wasn't really about rehabilitation or even proportional response to crime. There were no prison sentences where you'd learn a trade and rejoin society as a productive citizen. Prison existed, but only as a holding area where you waited for your actual punishment. The real penalty, the thing that happened after trial and conviction, was designed to be permanent. Permanent disfigurement through mutilation, permanent exile that removed you from civilization, or very, very permanent death, delivered through methods that ranged from relatively quick to horrifyingly prolonged. And the creativity? Romans approached punishment the way modern engineers approach problem solving. They had specialized tools, developed techniques, refined methods based on centuries of practice, and maintained an entire cultural apparatus dedicated to making examples of people who violated laws or simply angered the wrong official. The Colosseum, that iconic symbol of Roman engineering and architecture. Sure, gladiators fought there, thrilling crowds with skilled combat. But that same arena also hosted executions disguised as theatrical performances, where condemned criminals were forced to reenact myths, usually the parts where the hero dies horribly or gets eaten by monsters. The legal code was vast, specific, and sometimes bizarre by modern standards. There were punishments for theft, different punishments depending on what was stolen and who owned it, punishments for treason, which could mean anything from actual espionage to insufficiently enthusiastic applause when the emperor passed. Punishments for religious violations, from skipping required sacrifices to worshipping unapproved gods. Punishments for fraud, assault, murder, arson, and even insulting statues of deceased emperors who'd been deified. Each category of crime had appropriate punishments, and those punishments were calibrated not just to hurt, but to humiliate. Because in Rome, shame was almost worse than death. Almost. Being executed was bad. Being executed in a way that destroyed your dignity, mocked your crime, and turned your death into entertainment for thousands of spectators. That was the Roman way. They understood that the manner of death communicated messages about the crime, the criminal, and the power of the state, and the creativity. Romans approached punishment the way modern engineers approach problem solving. They had tools, techniques, and an entire cultural apparatus dedicated to making examples of people. The Colosseum. Sure, gladiators fought there, but that same arena also hosted executions disguised as theatrical performances, where condemned criminals were forced to reenact myths, usually the parts where the hero dies horribly. The legal code was vast and specific. There were punishments for theft, punishments for treason, punishments for religious violations, punishments for insulting the emperor's hairline. And each punishment was calibrated not just to hurt, but to humiliate. Here's where it gets even weirder. Not every execution included all four animals. Sometimes, due to availability or regional variation, executioners would substitute animals or reduce the number. Some accounts mention just a dog and a rooster. Others describe larger collections, adding cats or even eels. It depended on what the local executioner had access to and how creative they felt like being. The punishment was used sporadically throughout Roman history. Some emperors loved it, ordering it frequently as a deterrent. Others found it distasteful, not because it was cruel, but because it was old-fashioned. By the time of Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, crucifixion was often substituted for parricide cases. But poena culae never completely disappeared. It was occasionally revived, particularly under emperors who wanted to seem traditionally Roman. The last recorded use of something resembling poena culae occurred surprisingly late, well into the medieval period, when European cities still executing criminals occasionally borrowed from Roman precedent. But the classic version, with the full menagerie, seems to have faded by the 4th century CE. What makes poena culae so fascinating from a historical perspective is what it reveals about Roman values. This wasn't just about killing someone. It was about making their death reflect the cosmic disorder they'd created by murdering family. It was about transforming execution into a symbolic performance where every element had meaning. It was also, let's be honest, completely over the top. The Romans could have just drowned parricides. Simple, effective, done. But no. They needed the dog, the rooster, the snake, the monkey, the leather sack, the symbolism, the whole theatrical production. Because in Rome, punishment wasn't just about justice. It was about sending a message written in the language of calculated horror. Chapter 4. Damnatio ad bestias. Lunchtime at the Colosseum. If you've ever watched a movie about ancient Rome, you've probably seen some version of this. Criminals thrown to wild animals in the arena while crowds cheer. What you might not realize is how systematic, how organized, and how genuinely popular this form of execution was. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts, was one of Rome's favorite midday entertainment options. Morning at the Colosseum, animal hunts, where exotic beasts were slaughtered for fun. Afternoon, gladiator fights, the main event everyone came to see. But midday, during lunch, that was execution time. That was when the criminals came out. These weren't trials. The condemned had already been sentenced. They'd been convicted of crimes serious enough to warrant death, but not important enough to waste expensive gladiators on. So instead, they'd be sent into the arena, often unarmed or barely armed, to face animals specifically trained and starved to be aggressive. The variety of animals was staggering. Lions, obviously. Bears, particularly popular in the northern provinces. Leopards, wild bulls, wolves, and even stranger choices like ostriches, which might sound comical until you remember that ostriches can disembowel you with their claws. Rome imported animals from across the empire and beyond. If it was exotic and dangerous, Rome wanted it in the arena. The executions themselves varied wildly in their staging and cruelty. Sometimes condemned criminals would be tied to stakes or poles, unable to run or defend themselves, simply waiting for the animal to arrive. Other times they'd be given wooden weapons that looked impressive, but were completely useless against a lion or bear, not enough to actually defend themselves, but enough to make the spectacle last longer and seem more sporting. The crowd appreciated effort, even from the doomed. The animals themselves were trained, sort of. Beast handlers called bestiarii would starve animals before executions to ensure aggression. They'd also use various techniques to agitate them, loud noises, prodding, anything to make normally cautious animals attack on command. A well-fed lion might ignore a human, or kill quickly and efficiently. A starved, tormented lion would be far more reliably vicious and entertaining. The logistics of importing and maintaining these animals were staggering. Rome built holding facilities beneath arenas, entire underground complexes where animals were kept, fed, and managed. The hypogeum beneath the Colosseum, recently excavated and partially reconstructed, shows the engineering involved. Elevators and pulleys could raise caged animals directly into the arena floor, creating the illusion that they appeared from nowhere. Different animals required different handling. Lions and leopards were relatively straightforward, territorial predators that could be goaded into attacking. Bears were more unpredictable but equally dangerous. Bulls required special techniques, usually involving red fabric and movement to trigger their charging instinct. Wolves hunted in packs, so executions involving wolves would sometimes release several at once, creating a more chaotic and violent spectacle. Some executions were staged as mythological reenactments, transforming death into theatre. A criminal might be dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could charm wild animals with his lyre. In the myth, Orpheus successfully enchants beasts with his music, a beautiful story of art conquering nature. In the arena version, the criminal would be given a lyre, positioned among wild animals, and told to play. The animals, of course, were hungry and entirely uninterested in music. The condemned would die while the crowd appreciated the dark irony of myth-turned-murder. Another popular mythological execution involved Pasiphae and the bull. In Greek mythology, Pasiphae, wife of King Minos, was cursed to desire a bull. The arena version would involve a condemned woman being assaulted by a bull, a grotesque spectacle that combined execution with sexual violence and mythological reference. The depths of Roman depravity found new lows in these performances. Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun, became another template for execution theatre. A condemned criminal would be strapped to mechanical wings, hoisted high above the arena floor, then released. The fall would injure but not kill them immediately, leaving them broken and helpless when the bears or wild dogs were released. The crowd got myth, spectacle, and eventual death all in one performance. The popularity of these executions created an entire industry. Animal trappers worked across the empire and beyond, capturing exotic beasts for Roman arenas. Merchant networks transported them from Africa, Asia, and northern Europe. Handlers, trainers, and veterinarians made careers managing arena animals. The death of condemned criminals supported hundreds of jobs and generated significant economic activity. The scale of these executions was enormous. During the inauguration of the Colosseum in 80 CE, the games lasted 100 days. Thousands of animals were killed, and hundreds of criminals were executed. Contemporary accounts describe the arena floor soaked with blood, requiring constant fresh sand between events. This wasn't an occasional spectacle. This was industrial-scale public execution. Who were these condemned? Slaves, obviously. Rome had millions of enslaved people, and disobedient or rebellious slaves could expect the arena. Christians during periods of persecution, criminals convicted of serious crimes like murder or robbery, prisoners of war who weren't valuable enough to enslave, and sometimes just people who angered the wrong official. The crowd's reaction varied. Some sources describe audiences eating lunch, chatting, barely paying attention to the executions happening below. It was background entertainment, no more remarkable than music at a restaurant. Other accounts describe specific executions that caught attention, either because the condemned showed unusual courage or because the animal did something unexpected. What's particularly Roman about damnatio ad bestias is the efficiency. These executions served multiple purposes simultaneously. They disposed of criminals, reinforced Roman power, entertained the masses, demonstrated Rome's dominance over nature by showcasing exotic beasts, and reminded everyone watching that Roman law was absolute. One execution, 6 messages. The practice continued for centuries. Even as the empire Christianized, executions in the arena continued, though eventually the religious symbolism shifted and certain types of criminals were spared. By the 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the great arenas fell into disuse, not because Romans developed mercy, but because they could no longer afford to import exotic animals or maintain the infrastructure. But during Rome's height, damnatio ad bestias represented something deeply Roman. the transformation of death into entertainment, justice into spectacle, and the absolute certainty that if you broke Roman law, your end would be public, painful, and profitable for someone selling tickets. Chapter 5. Decimation when Rome punished. Entire units for maximum efficiency. Most punishments we've discussed targeted individuals, but Rome didn't limit itself to personal justice. Sometimes they needed to punish entire groups, and for that they invented decimation, a practice so brutal it gave us the modern word for massive destruction. Decimation, from the Latin decimatio, meaning removal of a tenth, was a military punishment reserved for units that had shown cowardice, mutinied, or otherwise catastrophically failed. And here's how it worked, in a process that managed to be both mathematically precise and psychologically devastating. First, the guilty unit, usually a cohort or legion, would be assembled. The commander would publicly announce their collective failure, ensuring everyone understood the severity of the situation. Then came the lottery. The soldiers would be divided into groups of 10. Each group would draw lots. The one who drew the short straw would be beaten to death by the other 9 members of his group, not by executioners, not by enemies, by his own unit members, men he'd fought beside, eaten with, trusted with his life. The method of execution was usually clubbing or stoning, carried out right there in front of the assembled legion. The 9 survivors would be forced to participate. There was no refusing, no mercy, no looking away. You either helped kill your comrade, or you joined him in death. The psychological impact of decimation was extraordinary. It didn't just punish the unlucky 10th, it traumatized the surviving 90%, who now had to live with having killed their friends. It created collective guilt, collective fear, and absolute certainty that Roman military discipline was a non-negotiable. The surviving soldiers weren't off the hook either. After the decimation, the entire unit would be forced to camp outside the main fortifications, exposed to enemy attack. Their rations would be reduced to barley instead of wheat, a humiliating demotion that marked them as less than human in Roman military culture. Decimation was used sparingly, precisely because it was so extreme. The most famous instance occurred in 71 BCE, when Crassus, facing the Spartacus rebellion, decimated units that had fled from battle. He selected 500 men from the army, divided them into 50s, and executed 10 of them. The message was clear: fear Spartacus if you want, but fear Roman discipline more. Appian, the Greek historian, described this decimation in detail. He noted that the soldiers forced to execute their comrades did so with clubs and stones, and that the remaining troops were made to witness the entire process. The sound alone must have been horrifying. The dull thuds, the screams, the absolute silence afterward. Other recorded decimations include instances under Augustus, who reportedly used the practice to restore discipline in legions that had mutinied. Later emperors occasionally threatened decimation but rarely followed through. The practice was so severe that even threatening it usually restored order. Here's the brilliant, horrible logic of decimation. It made cowardice more terrifying than death. Soldiers knew that if they ran from battle, they risked not just their own execution, but the possible death of their friends. And if they survived the lottery, they'd carry the guilt of killing those friends forever. It was a punishment that extended beyond the moment, creating trauma that lasted lifetimes. Decimation also reinforced the Roman belief that the collective mattered more than the individual. Your personal survival meant nothing compared to unit cohesion and military success. If 1 man failed, 10 paid. If 10 men failed, 100 paid. The mathematics of Roman discipline were brutal and non-negotiable. The practice eventually faded, not because Rome developed a conscience, but because the military structure changed. As the empire relied more on auxiliary troops and barbarian federates, traditional Roman disciplinary methods became less practical. You couldn't decimate Germanic warriors who might just laugh and rebel entirely. But during the Republic and early Empire, decimation represented Roman military culture at its most ruthless. It showed that Rome would rather damage its own forces than tolerate failure. It proved that Roman commanders valued discipline over manpower, and it created a legacy of fear that kept legions in line for centuries. When modern people say something has been decimated, they usually mean destroyed or severely damaged. That's softening it. True Roman decimation was the calculated sacrifice of soldiers by their own comrades, a punishment so psychologically devastating that the mere threat of it could stop mutinies before they started. Chapter 6. The Tarpeian Rock, where Roman traitors learned to fly. Let's talk about the Tarpeian Rock, one of Rome's oldest, most straightforward and most persistently used execution methods. If you were convicted of treason in Rome, particularly during the Republic, you might find yourself taking an unwilling leap from a cliff in the heart of the city. The Tarpeian Rock was a steep cliff face on the southern summit of the Capitoline Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills and home to the most important temples in the city. The drop was somewhere between 25 to 30 feet onto jagged rocks below. Not high enough to guarantee instant death, but high enough to ensure serious injury, and the rocks finished what the fall started. The punishment gets its name from Tarpeia, a legendary figure from Rome's founding myth. According to the story, Tarpeia was a Roman maiden who betrayed Rome to the Sabines during the war between the two peoples. She opened a gate for Sabine warriors in exchange for what they wore on their left arms, expecting golden bracelets. Instead, the Sabines crushed her with their shields, which they also carried on their left arms. She was buried where she died, and that spot became the Tarpeian Rock. Whether Tarpeia was real or not, the message was clear. This was where traitors went. This was where people who betrayed Rome met their end, and Rome took that message seriously for centuries. The execution process was simple compared to some of Rome's more elaborate punishments. The condemned would be brought to the Capitoline Hill, often in front of crowds. They'd be forced to the edge of the rock, sometimes after speeches denouncing their crimes, and then pushed or thrown over. No ceremony, no fanfare, just gravity and justice in their most basic forms. Who got the Tarpeian treatment? Traitors, obviously. People convicted of betraying military secrets, collaborating with enemies, or attempting to overthrow the government. But the definition of treason was flexible in Rome. Sometimes it meant actual espionage. Other times it meant insulting the emperor badly enough. The charge of treason, maestas, could be applied broadly, especially during the Empire when paranoid emperors saw conspiracies everywhere. Some sources mention that particularly egregious criminals, like murderers of family members or those who committed sacrilege, might also be thrown from the rock. The punishment wasn't limited to elite traitors. Slaves, foreigners, and common citizens could all take the plunge if their crimes warranted it. The location itself was significant. The Capitoline Hill housed the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the most important religious site in Rome. By executing traitors literally in the shadow of Jupiter's temple, Rome was making a theological statement as much as a legal one. Treason wasn't just a crime against the state, it was an offence against the gods themselves. Livy, the Roman historian, mentions the Tarpeian Rock multiple times in his histories of early Rome. He describes it as an established execution site by the time of the kings, suggesting the practice was ancient even by Republican standards. Later writers like Plutarch and Dio Cassius also reference executions at the Rock, confirming it remained in use through the Empire. One particularly notable case involves Spurius Cassius Vecelllinus, a consul accused of aspiring to kingship. in 485 BCE. He was tried, convicted, and thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, his body denied burial as additional punishment. Whether this specific story is historical or legendary is debated, but it reflects how Romans thought about the punishment. The practice eventually declined, like many Roman execution methods, as the empire Christianized and certain traditional punishments fell out of favor. By the late empire, the Tarpeian Rock was more historical curiosity than active execution site. The cliff itself still exists, though centuries of building and erosion have changed the landscape significantly. What made the Tarpeian Rock particularly Roman was its combination of simplicity and symbolism. This wasn't a complicated punishment requiring special equipment or exotic animals. It was just a cliff and gravity. But the location, in the heart of Rome's religious center, transformed a simple execution into a statement about divine and civic order. It was also efficient, which Romans appreciated. No need for executioners with special training, no exotic animals to feed and transport, no complex rituals. Just bring the traitor to the rock and let physics handle the rest. In a civilization that valued practical solutions alongside symbolic gestures, the Tarpeian Rock was perfect, simple, effective, and resonant with meaning. Chapter 7. Vivicombustion, when Rome turned arson into ironic justice. Now we enter the realm of punishment that matched crime in the most literal, horrible way possible. If you committed arson in Rome, if you deliberately burned buildings or property, Rome had a special punishment waiting for you, vivicombustion, being burned alive. This wasn't unique to Rome. Cultures throughout history have burned criminals, but Romans approached it with their characteristic attention to detail and public spectacle. This wasn't a quick execution. This was theatre, warning, and retribution all in one terrible package. The process typically began with the condemned being brought to a public space, often the same forum where trials occurred. They'd be tied to a stake, sometimes naked, sometimes in clothing soaked with flammable materials to ensure the fire caught quickly. Wood would be piled around the stake, oil might be added, and then the fire would be lit. The goal wasn't a fast death. That would defeat the purpose. The fire would be arranged to burn slowly, starting at the feet and working upward. The condemned would be conscious for most of it, aware of what was happening, feeling everything until smoke inhalation or shock finally provided relief. The crowds that gathered for these executions were large and vocal. Some sources describe spectators bringing food, treating the execution like entertainment. Others describe more somber reactions, particularly if the condemned maintained composure or pleaded convincingly. But either way, the execution was public, deliberately visible, and designed to deter anyone else thinking about arson. Why was arson punished so severely? Rome was a fire trap. The insulae, those multi-story apartment buildings housing most of the city's population, were made primarily of wood, with open flames used for cooking and heating. A single, carelessly placed lamp could destroy an entire block. Deliberate arson could devastate neighborhoods, kill hundreds, and destabilize the city. The Great Fire of 64 CE during Nero's reign destroyed large sections of Rome and left thousands homeless. Nero, whether he started the fire or not, needed scapegoats. He blamed Christians, and many were executed via vivicombustion. The irony of burning people accused of starting a fire wasn't lost on anyone, but Nero wasn't known for subtlety. Tacitus, the Roman historian, described these executions in detail. He wrote that Nero had Christians covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, while others were crucified or burned alive to provide nighttime illumination for Nero's gardens. Even Tacitus, no friend of Christians, noted that these punishments seemed excessive and generated sympathy for the victims. But vivicombustion wasn't reserved only for Christians or arsonists. The punishment was sometimes applied to practitioners of magic, particularly if their magic supposedly caused fires or other disasters. Sorceresses accused of cursing crops or causing plagues might face burning, with the fire symbolically purifying the evil they'd brought into the world. Women convicted of certain religious crimes, particularly Vestal virgins who broke their vow of chastity, were sometimes threatened with burning, though more often they were buried alive. The fire was reserved for crimes that involved literal or metaphorical burning, maintaining that Roman sense of matching punishment to crime. The technical aspects of vivicombustion reveal Roman precision. Executioners became skilled at arranging fires to maximize duration while ensuring eventual death. Too much. Fuel and the condemned died too quickly from smoke. Too little and the fire might go out before finishing the job. Finding the balance required practice, which tells you something grim about how frequently this punishment occurred. Different regions had variations. In some provinces, the condemned might be placed in a metal or clay container that was then heated, roasting them slowly. In others, they might be tied face down over a fire pit. The core concept remained the same: death by fire, slowly, publicly, with maximum suffering. The punishment declined during the late Empire, partly because of Christian influence against particularly cruel executions, and partly because the infrastructure for public executions deteriorated as the empire fragmented. But during Rome's height, vivicombustion was a regular feature of the justice system, a reminder that Rome controlled not just life and death, but the manner and duration of dying. What's particularly disturbing about vivicombustion is how it combined practical deterrence with symbolic meaning. It wasn't just about killing arsonists. It was about using their own weapon against them, making the punishment an embodiment of the crime. It was Rome saying, "You liked fire, here's fire. Enjoy." Chapter 8. The Stocks and Pillory. Public Humiliation as Sport. Not every Roman punishment ended in death. Sometimes the goal was humiliation, social destruction, and making someone wish they were dead without actually killing them. Enter the stocks and pillory, devices designed to hold criminals in public spaces where citizens could express their displeasure. The stocks typically secured a person's feet between wooden planks, forcing them to sit or lie in an uncomfortable position. The pillory secured the neck and wrists, forcing the condemned to stand hunched over, head and hands protruding through holes in a wooden board. Both devices were placed in high-traffic areas: forums, market squares, outside, amphitheatres. The punishment itself was exposure. The condemned would be locked in these devices for hours or days, displayed like merchandise. But the real punishment came from the public. Passers-by were not only allowed, but encouraged to participate in the humiliation. Rotten vegetables were a popular choice. Tomatoes, cabbage, whatever was available and past its prime, would be thrown at the condemned. Worse than vegetables were the contents of chamber pots. Yes, human waste was absolutely thrown at people in the stocks. The smell alone must have been unbearable, and the humiliation was the entire point. The crowds that gathered could be cruel. They'd mock, make jokes, sometimes throw rocks if they felt the crime warranted it. If you were popular, if you had friends and family, they might defend you or at least try to minimize harassment. But if you were universally disliked or had committed a particularly offensive crime, the pillory became a nightmare of non-stop abuse. Who ended up in stocks or pillories? Small-time criminals mostly. Thieves who stole minor items, con artists, people who cheated in business, individuals who violated market regulations by selling spoiled food or using rigged scales. These weren't crimes Rome considered serious enough for execution, but they required punishment and deterrence. Slaves were frequently pilloried for minor infractions. A slave who talked back, who failed to complete tasks, who showed insufficient respect, might spend hours or days in the stocks while their owner decided whether to sell them, beat them further, or eventually release them with a warning. The duration varied. Some sentences were a few hours, just long enough for the lunch crowd to pass through the forum. Others lasted days. Spending a night in the pillory, unable to sleep, attacked by rats, exposed to weather, was genuinely dangerous. People died in these devices, not from the restraints themselves, but from exposure, dehydration, or injuries, from aggressive crowds. The social consequences extended beyond the physical punishment. Being pilloried marked you. Everyone in the city saw you at your most humiliated. Your reputation was destroyed. Your business might collapse. Your family might be shamed by association. Even after release, you carried the stigma. Rome also used variations of these devices for specific crimes. Blasphemers might have their tongues secured with special clamps attached to the pillory. Market cheats might be pilloried, holding the fake weights or spoiled goods they'd sold. The punishment always included an element of visual communication, showing spectators exactly what crime had been committed. The practice was ancient and widespread, not unique to Rome, but certainly embraced by Roman culture. Throughout the provinces, local administrators used stocks and pillories to maintain order, without the expense and drama of formal executions. It was economical justice, requiring only wood and public space. Interestingly, the stocks and pillory sometimes served as a prelude to further punishment. A thief might be pilloried for a day, then branded, then sold into slavery. The progression of punishments was designed to give multiple opportunities for deterrence, while increasing severity if the condemned didn't learn their lesson. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. Being utterly helpless while strangers abuse you creates trauma that outlasts physical injuries. The inability to defend yourself, to cover your face, to escape the mockery, that's a special kind of torture that doesn't require whips or fire. As Rome Christianized, some church officials argued against the excessive cruelty of stocks and pillories, particularly when used for minor offences, but the devices remained common throughout the medieval period across Europe, suggesting that the Roman model of public humiliation as punishment had deep cultural roots. The stocks and pillory represent a different aspect of Roman punishment philosophy. Not everything required death or permanent injury. Sometimes destroying someone's social standing and public dignity was enough. Sometimes making someone an object of ridicule accomplished more than executing them. And Rome, ever practical, recognized that you couldn't execute everyone who broke minor laws, but you could definitely make them regret it. Chapter 9. Fustuarium, when your own legion became your executioner. We've talked about decimation, where 1 in 10 soldiers might be killed. Now let's discuss an even more personal military punishment. Fustuarium, a beating delivered by your own unit that was designed to kill you. Fustuarium was reserved for soldiers who committed serious military crimes, desertion in battle, theft from fellow soldiers, cowardice that endangered the unit, falling asleep on guard duty, or striking a superior officer. These weren't civil crimes handled by magistrates. These were military. Failures handled by military justice, which meant no mercy and no appeals. Here's how it worked. The condemned soldier would be brought before the tribune or commander, who would touch him with a staff, a simple gesture that officially sentenced him to death. Then the real horror began. The entire unit, the very soldiers the condemned had fought beside, would be assembled. They'd be given staffs, clubs, or stones. The condemned would be stripped, often beaten first to ensure he was already weakened, then forced into the center of a circle formed by his comrades. Then everyone would attack at once. It wasn't a quick execution. The condemned might try to run, to dodge, to protect his head. But he was surrounded, exhausted, unarmed, and facing hundreds of soldiers who knew they had to participate or be accused of sympathizing with a deserter. The beating would continue until the condemned stopped moving. Even then, soldiers would keep striking, ensuring death. The body would be left unburied, denied the funeral rites that Romans considered essential for the afterlife. The message wasn't just that cowardice was punished, it was that cowardice removed you from humanity itself. The psychological dimensions of fustuarium were extraordinary. Like decimation, it forced soldiers to kill their own comrades. But fustuarium was even more personal because everyone participated, everyone was equally guilty, and the condemned wasn't chosen by lottery. He'd actually committed the crime. This created a terrible logic. If you didn't beat your comrade hard enough, you might be accused of insufficient loyalty. But if you beat him too enthusiastically, you'd carry guilt forever. There was no good choice, which was exactly how Roman military discipline worked. Polybius, the Greek historian who accompanied Roman legions, described fustuarium in his histories. He noted that soldiers who survived fustuarium, which was rare, were still exiled from the camp and forbidden to return to their homes. Death wasn't just physical, it was social and spiritual. The punishment was used throughout Roman military history, though like decimation, it was employed sparingly. Commanders knew that excessive use would destroy unit morale and possibly trigger mutinies. But the threat of fustuarium hung over every soldier, a reminder that military law was absolute. Some sources mention variations. In certain cases, the condemned might be stoned instead of clubbed, or the execution might be carried out by specific soldiers rather than the entire unit. But the core concept remained. The unit itself, the military family, became the instrument of death. The practice reinforced Roman military values. Individual soldiers mattered less than unit cohesion. Personal survival was secondary to collective discipline, and if you failed your brothers in arms, those same brothers would be the ones to end you. Fustuarium also served a practical purpose. It externalized the execution, preventing any single soldier from being identified as the killer. Everyone was responsible, which meant no one faced individual blood guilt in Roman religious terms. The killing was collective, sanctioned, almost ritualistic. As the Roman military evolved, particularly during the late Empire when armies increasingly consisted of barbarian auxiliaries and federates, traditional Roman military punishments like fustuarium became less practical. Foreign warriors didn't share Roman military culture and might simply revolt if commanders tried to implement such punishments. But during the Republic and early Empire, fustuarium represented Roman military discipline at its purest and most brutal. It showed that the legion was a collective entity that policed itself, punished its own failures, and valued discipline above individual life. Chapter 10. Blinding and Mutilation. When Rome wanted you alive but broken. Not every punishment ended in death. Sometimes Rome wanted criminals to survive, but as visible warnings of what happened to lawbreakers. Enter the world of deliberate mutilation, where the punishment permanently marked your body and destroyed your ability to function in society. Blinding was particularly common. Convicted criminals, especially those guilty of fraud, perjury, or certain types of theft, might have their eyes removed or destroyed. The methods varied from crude gouging to more sophisticated approaches involving heated metal or caustic substances, but the result was the same: permanent blindness. Why blinding? In Roman society, a blind person couldn't work most jobs, couldn't serve in the military, and required care from family or community. They became a permanent burden and a walking advertisement for the consequences of crime. Every time someone saw a blind beggar, they'd wonder what crime he'd committed and whether similar punishment awaited them. The punishment also had religious dimensions. Romans believed eyes were windows to the soul, and that sight connected humans to the divine. Removing someone's eyes was a form of spiritual death, cutting them off from full participation in the world of light and civilization. Other forms of mutilation included cutting off hands for theft, particularly if the theft involved using tools or weapons. A thief without hands couldn't steal again, and the stumps served as permanent evidence of their crime. Some sources mention cutting off ears for eavesdropping or gossiping, though this seems to have been less common than other mutilations. Branding was technically mutilation, and extremely common. Convicted criminals would have letters burned into their foreheads or faces indicating their crime. F for fur, thief. K for calumniator, false accuser. S for service, slave. The brand was permanent, visible, and destroyed any hope of rejoining society anonymously. The process of branding was straightforward but painful. The condemned would be held down, often after being beaten into submission. A metal brand would be heated until glowing, then pressed firmly against the forehead or cheek. The skin would burn, scar tissue would form, and the letter would remain visible for life. Fugitive slaves received special treatment. If caught after running away, they might be branded on the forehead with FUG for fugitivus. Some slaves were branded multiple times, creating a visible history of attempts at freedom and subsequent recapture. The accumulated brands made hiding impossible. Castration appeared in Roman law for specific crimes, particularly those involving sexual assault or violations of sexual propriety. Though less common than other mutilations, it was occasionally employed, especially in the eastern provinces where the practice had longer cultural precedent. Tongue removal or partial tongue removal was punishment for blasphemy, perjury, or particularly offensive speech against the emperor or gods. The message was clear: if you can't use your tongue properly, you don't deserve one. The condemned would be left able to make sounds but unable to speak clearly, a living example of silent dissent. The legal framework for mutilation was complex. Roman citizens had some protections against certain mutilations, though these protections weakened during the empire. Non-citizens, slaves and foreigners had virtually no protection. Their bodies were considered property of the state, to be marked and altered as justice demanded. Interestingly, some mutilations were combined with other punishments. A thief might be branded, have a hand removed, and then be sent to work in mines. The accumulation of punishments ensured that even if they somehow escaped the mines, their branded face and missing hand would make integration into society impossible. The medical aftermath of these mutilations was horrific. Without modern antibiotics or surgical techniques, many victims died from infections. Those who survived faced lives of pain, disability, and social ostracism. They often ended up as beggars dependent on charity, visible reminders of Roman justice. Some emperors were particularly fond of mutilation. Nero, always creative in his cruelty, reportedly had various enemies blinded or mutilated in imaginative ways. Caracalla allegedly ordered mass mutilations after putting down rebellions. The specific emperor in power often determined how frequently and severely mutilation was employed. The practice eventually declined, particularly as Christianity spread, and church officials argued that mutilation was cruel and prevented criminals from repenting and rejoining Christian society. But it never completely disappeared. Elements of Roman mutilation punishment persisted through the medieval period and beyond. What made Roman mutilation particularly effective as deterrence was its permanence. You couldn't hide a brand or missing hand. Your punishment followed you forever, in every interaction, every glance from strangers, every moment you caught your reflection. The crime was over, but the consequence was eternal. Chapter 11, Damnatio Memoriae, erasing you from history itself. Now we shift from physical punishments to something more abstract but equally devastating, damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. This was Rome's way of punishing someone not just in life but throughout eternity by attempting to erase them from existence itself. Damnatio memoriae wasn't a single punishment, but a collection of practices designed to destroy someone's legacy. It was typically reserved for emperors, high-ranking officials, or prominent citizens who had fallen spectacularly from favour. The goal was to make it as if they'd never existed. The process was systematic and thorough, revealing Roman bureaucratic efficiency applied to historical erasure. The condemned person's name would be chiselled off monuments, inscriptions, and public buildings throughout the empire. This wasn't a simple matter of removing a few statues. It required coordinating craftsmen across thousands of miles, sending official notices to provincial governors, and ensuring that every reference, no matter how minor, was found and eliminated. Their images would be defaced in sculptures, paintings, mosaics, and coins. Coins were particularly important because they circulated widely and carried the emperor's image to even the remotest corners of the empire. After damnatio memoriae, coins bearing the condemned person's image would be recalled, melted down, and recast. Thousands of coins might be destroyed to erase a single face from currency. Documents mentioning the condemned would be altered or destroyed. Official records, tax documents, military rosters, anything with their name would be revised. Scribes would carefully scrape the condemned name off papyrus or parchment and replace it with a generic phrase like the traitor, or simply leave a blank space where the name had been. Family members might be forbidden from speaking the name aloud, creating a social death that extended beyond physical execution. Imagine living in a society where mentioning your own parent, spouse, or sibling could result in your arrest or worse. The silence enforced around the condemned person created a void where they'd once existed, a person-shaped absence in history. Public ceremonies sometimes accompanied damnatio memoriae. The Senate might formally curse the condemned person's memory, calling on gods to ensure their spirit found no rest. Priests might perform rituals to cleanse Rome of the pollution the person had caused. The condemnation wasn't just legal and social, it was spiritual and cosmic. The effort required for thorough damnatio memoriae was enormous and expensive. Archaeologists have studied inscriptions where names were removed, and the precision is remarkable. Masons would carefully chisel away only the condemned name, leaving the rest of the inscription intact and readable. Each letter would be removed at the same depth, creating a smooth blank space that clearly indicated intentional erasure rather than natural damage. Some inscriptions show multiple erasures, suggesting the same stone might have held names of several individuals who subsequently fell from favour. A single monument could become a physical record of political purges, each blank space representing someone once powerful enough to be commemorated but fallen far enough to be erased. The thoroughness extended to private spaces. Authorities would sometimes search homes looking for portraits, letters, or documents mentioning the condemned. Private correspondence might be confiscated and burned. Family shrines, where ancestors were honoured, would be inspected to ensure no images or name tablets of the condemned remained. Historical accounts describe instances where entire buildings or monuments associated with condemned individuals were demolished. Not just their names removed, but the physical structures they'd built or dedicated were torn down. This was particularly common when the condemned had been emperors who'd commissioned significant construction projects. Their architectural legacy would be destroyed or reassigned to other emperors. The propaganda value of damnatio memoriae was significant. By erasing someone so thoroughly, Rome demonstrated that individual legacy meant nothing compared to state power. You could be emperor, the most powerful person in the known world, and Rome could still make it as if you'd never existed. The message to potential rebels, traitors, or overly ambitious officials was clear. No one is too important to erase. The psychological impact extended to family members. Imagine being the child of someone subjected to damnatio memoriae. You couldn't speak about your parent, display their image, or even acknowledge their existence without risking punishment yourself. Your family history was officially ended. The practice had religious dimensions. Romans believed that memory and proper burial rites were essential for the afterlife. Without memory, without your name being spoken, your spirit might be trapped, unable to rest. Damnatio memoriae was spiritual death on top of physical death. Interestingly, the punishment sometimes backfired. By so thoroughly erasing someone, Rome sometimes created mystery and fascination. Modern historians know about some figures primarily because they were subjected to damnatio memoriae, the very erasure making them notable. The Senate held the power to declare damnatio memoriae, though emperors could also order it. The process often happened immediately after someone's death or fall from power. While emotions were high and political enemies were eager to demonstrate their loyalty to the new regime by enthusiastically destroying the old one, different levels of damnatio existed. Complete erasure was rare and reserved for the most hated figures. Partial damnatio might remove someone's name from certain contexts, but allow family to keep private memorials. The specifics depended on the severity of their crimes and the political climate. Some condemned individuals had their names replaced with insults. Instead of removing the name entirely, inscriptions might be altered to read traitor, tyrant, or enemy of the people. This served dual purposes. It explained the erasure and reinforced the official narrative about why the person deserved condemnation. The practice required significant resources. Sending craftsmen across the empire to chisel names off monuments wasn't cheap or quick. That Rome invested this effort shows how seriously they took the symbolic power of memory and representation. Surviving damnatio memoriae was possible. Some individuals had their memories rehabilitated by later emperors or the Senate. Names would be recarved onto monuments, statues re-erected, and historical records amended. Memory could be condemned, but sometimes it could be restored. The most complete surviving example of damnatio memoriae is probably the case of Geta, co-emperor with his brother Caracalla. After Caracalla murdered Geta, he ordered total damnatio memoriae. Geta's face was chiseled off family portraits, his name removed from documents, and even mentioning him became potentially fatal. What's particularly Roman about damnatio memoriae is how it reveals their understanding of power and legacy. They recognized that reputation and memory were forms of immortality, that being remembered was its own kind of survival. By attacking memory, they attacked something fundamental to Roman identity. The practice continued beyond Rome, influencing how later civilizations thought about historical memory and political punishment. Soviet Russia erased purged officials from photographs. Modern authoritarian regimes still attempt to control historical narrative. The Roman innovation of weaponizing memory proved enduring. But there's irony in damnatio memoriae. The people Rome tried hardest to erase, Nero, Domitian, Commodus, are some of the most famous Roman emperors today. Their crimes and punishments made them memorable. Rome tried to condemn their memory, but in doing so, ensured we'd never forget them. Chapter 12. Mining and Quarrying, Slow Death by Endless Labour. Not all Roman punishments were dramatic public spectacles. Some were designed to extract maximum labour before inevitable death, and for these, Rome had mines and quarries. Welcome to Damnatio ad Metallo, condemnation to the mines where life expectancy was measured in months, and death came slowly through exhaustion, disease, and despair. Condemned criminals, slaves, prisoners of war, and Christians during persecutions were sent to mines throughout the empire. The most notorious were in Sardinia, Spain, and Egypt, where conditions were so brutal that assignment there was effectively a death sentence with extra steps. The mines extracted gold, silver, copper, tin, and other metals essential to Roman economy and military. The quarries produced marble, granite, and limestone for Rome's endless construction projects. Both required massive labour forces willing to work in conditions no free person would accept. The condemned would be branded, often on the forehead, marking them as mine workers. They'd be chained, usually in groups, and marched to mining sites that could be hundreds of miles from where they were sentenced. The journey alone killed many. Once at the mine, life became a cycle of descent, labour, and survival. Miners worked in shifts, sometimes descending hundreds of feet into narrow tunnels lit only by oil lamps. The air was thick with dust, the tunnels prone to collapse, and ventilation virtually non-existent. The work itself was crushing in every sense. Miners used basic tools, picks, hammers, chisels, and their bare hands to extract ore from solid rock. The quotas were enforced brutally. Each miner had to produce a certain amount of ore per day, and failure to meet your quota meant punishment. You'd be beaten with clubs, denied food, placed in chains even heavier than normal, or killed outright as an example to others. The overseers, often former miners who'd proven their loyalty, through years of survival and betrayal of fellow workers, showed no mercy. The daily routine was grinding. Wake at dawn, if you could call it waking when you'd barely slept in the first place. A bowl of grain porridge, more water than grain, sometimes with weevils if you were unlucky. Then the descent into darkness, carrying your tools, shuffling in chains with other condemned workers. The tunnels were narrow, sometimes only a few feet high, requiring crawling or hunched walking for hours. The work would continue until the sun set above, though in the deepest mines you'd never know what time it was. Your world became the circle of lamplight, the feel of rock beneath your hands, and the endless rhythm of striking stone. Strike, break, gather. Strike, break, gather. Hour after hour, day after day, until your hands bled, your back spasmed, and your mind started to fracture from the monotony and darkness. Ventilation was a constant problem. The deeper mines could extend hundreds of feet underground, and getting fresh air to the lowest levels was nearly impossible with Roman technology. Miners would sometimes pass out from lack of oxygen. Some never woke up. The bodies would be dragged to the surface and dumped, their quota redistributed among surviving workers, who now had even more reason to fear falling short. Cave-ins were the constant terror. Roman mining techniques involved following ore veins wherever they led, often creating unstable tunnel networks. No modern safety standards, no structural supports beyond occasional wooden beams, no engineering surveys to determine safe digging limits. When a tunnel collapsed, dozens of miners might be buried instantly. If you were close to the cave-in but not buried, you'd hear the screams, the rumbling, then silence. The overseers would seal off the collapsed section and redirect workers elsewhere. No rescue attempts, no recovery of bodies. The rock became their tomb. Water was both essential and dangerous. Mines needed water for various processes, but too much water meant flooding. Some mines had rudimentary drainage systems, channels cut to let water flow out. Others relied on bucket chains, lines of workers passing buckets up from flooded sections. But in the deepest mines, water would accumulate, creating underground lakes that miners had to wade through or work around. The mines in southern Spain, particularly those extracting silver, were notoriously deadly. The veins ran deep, requiring extensive tunnelling. The ore contained lead and other toxic metals, exposure to which caused slow poisoning. Miners would develop tremors, madness, and painful deaths from heavy metal accumulation in their bodies. The silver that enriched Rome was literally bought with the slow, toxic deaths of condemned workers. Egypt's eastern desert hosted some of the worst mines. The heat alone killed workers. Operating in desert conditions without adequate water, performing hard labour underground where temperatures could exceed 40 degrees Celsius, 104 Fahrenheit, miners would drop from heat exhaustion regularly. The overseers, somewhat pragmatically, would reduce quotas slightly during the hottest months, not from compassion, but because dead workers produced nothing. Night brought no real rest. The barracks were overcrowded, with miners sleeping on stone floors or wooden platforms stacked like shelves. You'd be chained to prevent escape, usually to other workers, forming a human chain that made even rolling over a coordinated effort. The smell was indescribable. Hundreds of unwashed bodies, untreated wounds, disease, and despair in enclosed spaces with no ventilation. Disease spread like fire through mining camps. Respiratory infections from breathing rock dust all day. Dysentery from contaminated water and unsanitary conditions. Wounds that became infected and killed within days. There was no medical care beyond crude amputation if a hand or foot became gangrenous, and even that was only performed if someone thought you might survive and continue working. The psychological strategies for survival were as important as physical endurance. Some miners formed bonds with others, creating small support networks that shared extra food or warned each other about dangerous sections of tunnel. These bonds were fragile, easily broken by the constant threat of death, but they provided minimal human connection in an otherwise dehumanizing existence. Others retreated into their mines. They'd recite poetry if they'd known any before condemnation. They'd remember better times, family, freedom, the sun. Some went mad from the memories, crying out for loved ones who would never come. Others used memories as armor, a mental shield against the present reality. If you could spend your time in the mines mentally living in the past, you could survive the present. Religion provided solace for some. Christian miners, particularly those condemned for their faith, would hold secret prayer sessions in the deepest tunnels where overseers rarely ventured. They'd share communion with bread smuggled from rations and water from the mine pools. The faith that condemned them to the mines also sustained them through it, or at least that's what church records written by survivors claim. The rare escapes that succeeded became legendary among mining communities. Stories would circulate of a condemned man who'd somehow gotten his chains off, killed an overseer, stolen his clothes, and walked out pretending to be a visitor, or of a group that had tunneled sideways instead of down, emerging miles from the mine and fleeing into wilderness. Most of these stories were probably fiction, hope disguised as history, but they served a purpose. They reminded miners that freedom, however impossible, theoretically existed beyond the rock. Injuries were constant. Cave-ins, falling rocks, tool accidents, and simple exhaustion created a steady flow of wounded miners. Medical care was non-existent. Injured workers who couldn't continue were either left to die or killed outright to free up space and rations. The psychological toll was immense. Miners knew they'd never leave. There was no release date, no pardon to hope for. You'd work until you died, whether that took weeks or years. Some went mad in the darkness. Others gave up, refusing to eat or work, choosing quick punishment over slow death. Escape attempts were rare and usually unsuccessful. Even if you got out of the mine, you were branded, probably hundreds of miles from home, in unfamiliar territory. Recapture meant crucifixion or immediate execution, often in front of other miners as deterrence. Christian sources describe mining punishments in particular detail because so many early Christians were sent to mines during persecutions. Church records mention bishops, priests, and ordinary believers condemned to mines for refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods. Some survived years through community support and faith. Most didn't. The economic logic of mine labour was simple. Why pay workers when criminals and slaves were free? Rome's entire mining industry ran on condemned labour. The suffering of thousands of miners kept gold flowing to the treasury, silver minting into coins, and marble building into monuments. Different mines had different reputations. Some were considered worse than others. The sulphur mines were particularly dreaded. The fumes alone could kill within days. The deep gold mines of Spain were notorious for cave-ins. Egyptian quarries, working in desert heat, offered their own special hell. Women and children weren't exempt. Families of condemned criminals might be sent to mines together. Children as young as 8 or 9 would work in the narrowest tunnels where adults couldn't fit, dragging ore baskets through spaces barely large enough to crawl. The mines operated year-round, regardless of weather. Winter brought freezing temperatures to some mining regions. Summer brought unbearable heat. Neither season offered relief from quotas or labour demands. The work never stopped, and neither did the dying. Some miners developed a grim pride in survival. Veterans who lasted months or even years gained status among other condemned workers. They'd teach new arrivals how to avoid cave-ins, which overseers were most brutal, and how to stretch meagre rations. This informal knowledge network was the only social structure in an otherwise dehumanizing system. Occasionally mines would be raided by bandits or rebels hoping to free workers and swell their ranks. But freed miners, branded and broken, often struggled to reintegrate into society. Many ended up as bandits themselves, the only life available to marked criminals. The practice of condemning criminals to mines continued throughout the Roman period and beyond. Even as the empire declined, mines kept operating, powered by condemned labour. The system was too profitable, too useful for disposal of unwanted populations to abandon. What made damnatio ad metallo particularly Roman was the efficiency. It combined punishment, labour extraction, and eventual death into a single system. The condemned were punished through brutal work. That work generated wealth for the state, and death came slowly enough that maximum labour was extracted first. It was systematic, economical, and absolutely merciless. Modern estimates suggest tens of thousands of people worked in Roman mines at any given time, with turnover measured in months rather than years. The total number condemned to mines over Rome's history likely reached hundreds of thousands. Most died anonymous, unmarked, forgotten, except as data points in Rome's economic machine. Chapter 13. Ad gladium, the quick death that wasn't always quick. Let's talk about what might seem like Rome's most merciful punishment, ad gladium, condemnation to the sword. This was supposed to be a quick, clean death by decapitation, reserved for citizens or particularly respected criminals whose crimes warranted death, but who deserved to die with some dignity. The theory was simple. You'd be taken to the execution site, usually inside a prison or military camp, rather than a public square. An executioner would use a sword to remove your head in a single stroke. Quick, relatively painless, and lacking the public humiliation of other execution methods. The reality was often messier. Professional executioners existed, specialists who performed beheadings regularly and had developed the skill to do it efficiently. But not every execution had access to these experts. Sometimes soldiers perform the task, and soldiers trained for combat, not precise decapitation. A skilled executioner aimed for the space between vertebrae, using a sharp sword and proper angle to sever the head cleanly. When done correctly, death was nearly instantaneous. The condemned might not even feel the blow before consciousness ended. When done incorrectly, which happened more often than you'd think, the result was horrifying. A dull blade, wrong angle, or hesitant executioner could result in multiple strikes. The condemned would feel the first blow, the pain, the realization that it hadn't worked, and the terror of waiting for the next attempt. Historical accounts describe executions requiring 3, 4, even 5 strikes before finally severing the head. Imagine being the person on the block, feeling blade hit bone, knowing you're still alive, still conscious, waiting for the next blow that might or might not finish the job. The condemned's position mattered. Kneeling was standard, but the exact posture, how straight the neck, how still the person remained, affected execution success. A terrified person moving at the wrong moment could turn a clean beheading into a butchery. Who received ad gladium? Roman citizens convicted of serious crimes like murder or treason could request it, instead of crucifixion or other harsher punishments. High-ranking officials who fell from favour might be granted the sword as a final courtesy. Military commanders who failed catastrophically might be allowed to die by sword rather than face more degrading ends. The most famous case is probably Cicero, the great Roman orator and statesman. When Mark Antony's soldiers hunted him down during the proscriptions of 43 BCE, Cicero didn't resist. He was beheaded, though accounts vary on whether it required multiple blows. His head and hands were then displayed in the Roman Forum as a warning. Paul of Tarsus, the Christian apostle, being a Roman citizen, was reportedly executed by beheading in Rome around 65 CE. Christian tradition holds that as a citizen, he was spared the cross that killed Peter and instead received the sword. Whether this made his death any less terrible is debatable. The sword wasn't always used for beheading. Some executions involved stabbing or cutting the throat, methods that were technically ad gladium but lacked the supposed mercy of clean decapitation. These methods were slower, more painful, and often used for non-citizens or criminals who didn't warrant full beheading. The execution site varied. Inside prisons, the condemned might be brought to a dedicated execution chamber, often underground, where the body could be disposed of without public attention. Military executions might occur in the camp courtyard, witnessed by the legion as a disciplinary lesson. After execution, disposal of the body depended on the condemned's status. Citizens might be released to family for burial. Non-citizens or particularly hated criminals might be thrown into the Tiber, left for dogs, or dumped in mass graves outside the city. The body was dead, but the punishment continued through denial of proper burial. Some condemned prisoners were given the option of suicide rather than execution. This was considered more dignified, allowing the person to die by their own hand rather than an executioner's. They'd be provided with a sword and left alone. Most took the option, though stories exist of individuals who hesitated, prolonging the agony of decision. The sword used for executions became ritually significant. Some executioners kept the same blade for years, claiming it became more effective with use. Others believed each blade absorbed the souls of those it killed, making it spiritually dangerous to use for anything else. Interestingly, beheading's status as a mercy evolved. During the Republic, it was just one execution method among many. By the late Empire, particularly as other punishments became more elaborate and cruel, the simple sword started to be seen as almost generous. Context changes everything. The practice continued long after Rome fell. European executioners in medieval and early modern periods still used beheading for nobility and important criminals. The association between the sword and relatively dignified execution persisted for centuries, a legacy of Roman legal tradition. What made ad gladium particularly Roman was the class distinction. Your manner of death reflected your social status. Citizens died by sword, non-citizens by cross or beasts. Even in death, the hierarchy persisted. The method of execution communicated not just that you'd committed a crime, but who you were in Roman society. Chapter 14. The Mamertine Prison and Death by Starvation. We've covered spectacular public executions, but sometimes Rome preferred prisoners die quietly, out of sight, in the darkness beneath the city. The Mamertine Prison, Rome's most notorious dungeon, was where enemies of the state went to be forgotten and slowly waste away. The Mamertine, also called the Tullianum, was carved into the bedrock beneath the Capitoline Hill. It consisted of 2 chambers, one on top of the other, accessed by a hole in the floor of the upper chamber. Prisoners would be lowered into the lower chamber, called the Tullianum, a space barely large enough to stand, with no windows, no light, and no escape. The conditions were indescribably grim. The lower chamber was cold, damp, and completely dark. Water seeped through the rock, creating a permanent film of moisture on the walls and floor. The air was stale, oxygen limited, and the smell, bodies, waste, despair, was overwhelming. Prisoners in the Tullianum were left to die. Sometimes this meant starvation, other times strangulation, occasionally just abandonment until death came naturally. The method varied, but the location remained constant. Rome's most important prisoners died in this hole beneath the city. Who ended up in the Mamertine? Enemy leaders captured in war were traditional guests. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who led a massive rebellion against Julius Caesar, was imprisoned in the Mamertine for 6 years before being paraded in Caesar's triumph and then executed. Jugurtha, the Numidian king who fought Rome in North Africa, starved to death in the Tullianum after his capture. The process of dying by starvation was deliberately slow. The condemned would be lowered into the chamber, often after public display or trial. Then nothing. No food, limited water, no human contact except possibly guards checking whether death had occurred yet. Starvation doesn't kill quickly or painlessly. The first days bring intense hunger, weakness, difficulty concentrating. After a week, the body begins consuming its own muscle and fat. Hallucinations become common. The immune system collapses, making even minor infections deadly. Death typically comes after 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes longer if the prisoner had access to water. The psychological torture rivaled the physical. Complete darkness meant losing track of time. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The silence was broken only by water dripping and your own breathing. Isolation was total. You'd die alone, in the dark, with no one knowing or caring when it finally ended. Some prisoners were strangled before being thrown into the Tullianum, their bodies left there as a final insult. Others were strangled during imprisonment, executioners descending through the hole to finish the job when starvation was taking too long. The distinction between execution site and tomb blurred. Christian tradition holds that both Peter and Paul were imprisoned in the Mamertine before their executions. Whether historically accurate or not, the tradition reflects the prison's reputation as the end point for Rome's most important enemies. The prison's location was significant. Beneath the Capitoline Hill, under the very centre of Roman religious and political power, enemies of Rome died in darkness. The geography reinforced the message. No matter how powerful you once were, Rome reduced you to nothing. Archaeological evidence shows the Mamertine was used for centuries, from the Roman kingdom through the empire. The stone walls bore witness to uncounted deaths. each prisoner joining the anonymous mass of Rome's defeated enemies. The upper chamber, while still a prison, was marginally better. It had a small opening for air and light, allowing guards to pass food or water to prisoners awaiting trial or execution. But the lower chamber, the Tullianum proper, was reserved for those Rome wanted erased. Some sources suggest the Tullianum occasionally flooded, water rising through cracks in the bedrock. Prisoners trapped in the lower chamber would drown slowly as water levels rose. Whether this was intentional or accidental is unclear, but either way, it added another method of death to the prison's repertoire. The practice of imprisoning enemies in the Mamertine reflected Roman attitudes about defeated foes. After the triumph, after the public humiliation, enemies didn't deserve quick deaths. They deserved to be forgotten, to waste away in darkness, to die knowing they'd failed completely. The prison still exists today, now called the Carcer Tullianum, converted into a Christian chapel but still containing the ancient chambers. Visitors can descend into the lower chamber and experience a fraction of what condemned prisoners faced, though modern lighting and the knowledge that you can leave whenever you want make it incomparable to the original horror. What made the Mamertine particularly Roman was the combination of practicality and symbolism. It efficiently disposed of important prisoners while reinforcing Roman supremacy. It required minimal resources, just a hole in the ground and patience, and it sent a clear message. No matter who you were, no matter what you'd accomplished, Rome could reduce you to a forgotten corpse in the dark. Chapter 15. Why Ancient Rome's Punishments Still Matter. We've journeyed through the darkest corners of Roman justice, from crucifixion to animal attacks, from decimation to damnatio memoriae. You might be wondering why any of this matters beyond historical curiosity. The answer is uncomfortable. Roman punishment philosophy influenced Western legal systems for centuries, and echoes still resonate today. Roman law distinguished between citizens and non-citizens, creating a two-tier justice system that justified differential treatment. This concept, that legal status, determines rights and protections, persisted through European legal development and influenced colonial legal systems worldwide. The idea that some people deserve more legal protection than others is distinctly Roman. The Roman emphasis on public punishment as deterrence shaped how Western societies thought about criminal justice for over 1,000 years. Public executions continued in Europe and America well into the modern era, justified by the same logic Romans used. Visible punishment deters crime. The spectacle of suffering as a tool of social control didn't disappear with Rome. It evolved. The gradation of punishments based on social class, another Roman innovation, influenced medieval and early modern European legal codes. Nobility received different punishments than commoners, who received different punishments than slaves. This stratification reflected Roman precedent and wasn't fully dismantled until democratic reforms of the 18th and 19th centuries. Roman military discipline, particularly concepts like decimation and fustuarium, influenced how later military organizations thought about unit cohesion and collective punishment. While modern militaries don't randomly execute soldiers, the idea that military law operates differently from civilian law, that unit discipline justifies harsher penalties, traces back to Roman practice. The concept of making punishment fit the crime, poenaculae for parricide, burning for arson, reflects an attitude about proportional justice that still influences sentencing philosophy. Modern debates about whether drug dealers should face harsher penalties than users, or whether white-collar crime deserves punishment equal to violent crime, echo Roman concerns about matching penalty to offence. Damnatio memoriae, attempting to erase someone from history, found modern parallels in Soviet photo editing, fascist historical revisionism, and contemporary debates about removing controversial monuments. Rome's understanding that controlling historical memory as a form of power remains relevant in discussions about how societies remember or forget their past. But perhaps the most important legacy is what Roman punishments reveal about human nature and political power. Rome didn't invent cruelty, but it systematized it, turning punishment into policy, spectacle into statecraft, and suffering into a tool of governance. Understanding this helps us recognize similar patterns today. Modern prison systems, while vastly more humane than Roman dungeons, still struggle with questions Rome faced. How do we balance punishment with rehabilitation? What role should public perception play in sentencing? How do we prevent the justice system from becoming a tool of political oppression? These aren't new questions. Romans asked them too, even if their answers horrify us. The theatrical nature of Roman punishment, turning executions into entertainment, might seem impossibly distant from modern sensibilities, but execution viewing galleries, televised trials, and public interest in crime and punishment suggest we haven't entirely moved past Rome's instincts. We've civilized the expression, but the fascination with justice as spectacle persists. Roman punishments also remind us that legal systems reflect cultural values. Rome valued hierarchy, military discipline, public order, and visible demonstrations of power. Their punishments embodied these values. Modern democracies theoretically value equality, rehabilitation, and human rights. Our justice systems should reflect these values, but examining Roman precedent reveals how far we've come and how far we still need to go. The extremity of Roman punishments can also recalibrate our perspective on modern justice. When you understand that people were once sewn into sacks with animals and drowned, or crucified by the thousands, or slowly starved in underground chambers, modern punishments, even controversial ones, exist in a different context. This doesn't justify current injustices, but it does highlight progress. However, we must be careful not to use Roman cruelty to excuse contemporary failures. The fact that ancient societies were brutal doesn't make modern brutality acceptable. Instead, Roman punishments should serve as a warning about what happens when legal systems prioritize order over humanity, when punishment becomes performance, and when fear replaces justice as the foundation of law. The personal stories behind Roman punishments matter too. Every crucified slave, every gladiator forced to fight, every prisoner in the Mamertine was a person with hopes, fears, and humanity that Rome chose to ignore. Remembering this personalizes the horror and reminds us that legal systems operate on individuals, not abstractions. Education about historical punishments serves a purpose beyond satisfying dark curiosity. It helps us understand how legal philosophies develop, how cultural values shape justice, and how easy it is for societies to normalize cruelty when it serves political purposes. Rome thought their system was just, proportional, and necessary. Future societies will judge ours the same way we judge Rome. The question isn't whether we're better than Rome. Obviously, modern democracies don't crucify rebels or throw criminals to lions. The question is whether we've truly moved beyond the underlying assumptions that made Roman punishments possible, that some lives matter less than others, that public suffering deters crime, that justice requires visible pain, that power must be demonstrated through punishment. Rome fell, but its legal legacy didn't. Elements of Roman law, including concepts about punishment, property, and social hierarchy, were preserved through Byzantine codification, incorporated into medieval European law, and carried forward into modern legal systems. Understanding this continuity helps us recognize which aspects of our justice systems are inherited assumptions rather than self-evident truths. Studying Roman punishments is uncomfortable because it forces confrontation with human capacity for systematized cruelty. But discomfort serves a purpose. It makes us question assumptions, examine current practices, and consider whether our justice systems truly reflect our stated values or merely reproduce ancient patterns in modern dress. The most important lesson from Roman punishments might be the simplest. Legal systems are human constructs that reflect the societies that create them. Rome's brutal punishments weren't inevitable or natural. They were choices made by people who believed those choices were justified. We make choices too, about how we punish, who we punish, and what purposes punishment serves. Understanding Rome's choices helps us make better ones. So yes, Roman punishments were bizarre, creative, and horrifying, but they weren't random or meaningless. They were carefully designed tools of power, social control, and cultural communication. And understanding them isn't just about appreciating how much worse things used to be. It's about recognizing the same impulses, the same logic, the same dangerous assumptions that can corrupt any justice system, including our own. Rome's greatest punishment might be the one it inflicted on history itself, proving that sophisticated civilizations, impressive legal codes, and advanced cultures are completely compatible with systematic cruelty. That's the lesson we can't afford to forget. Outro, so there you have it. The most bizarre, brutal, and psychologically devastating punishments from ancient Rome and beyond. From crucifixion to sacks full of animals, from decimation to damnatio memoriae, Rome turned punishment into an art form, and not the kind you'd want displayed in a museum. If you made it this far, congratulations. You've survived a tour through the darkest corners of ancient justice. If this video made you grateful for modern legal systems, despite all their flaws, that's probably the healthiest reaction. Did I miss any particularly horrible Roman punishments? Let me know in the comments. Though honestly, we've covered enough trauma for one video. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical horror, make sure to hit that subscribe button and check out our other videos about why you wouldn't want to live in basically any time period before antibiotics and human rights. Thanks for watching, and remember, the next time you think modern life is tough, at least you're not being sewn into a sack with a monkey, a dog, a rooster, and a snake. That's the bar. We've cleared it. See you in the next video.